So this morning we want to talk about all of you who are all over social media, all the social media police, all the social media journalists, all the social media bacchanalists who are saying, well, the Prime Minister was wrong that the police cannot enter your private property. Now, I have to tell you, I am between two minds, right? They can enter, but will it be to enforce the public health regulations? We invite to the program at this time Mr. Keith Scotland. Good morning to you, Mr. Scotland.
Good morning, madam.
And how are you?
Fine, thank you. I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, there was this huge debate about what the Prime Minister said last Saturday as to whether or not he was, well, it wasn't Saturday, Thursday, whether or not he was accurate that the police can enter your private property. But I think the discrepancy came as to whether the police can enter to enforce the public health regulations or not. Can the police enter your private property to enforce the public health regulations?
The answer to my mind is yes, in conjunction, of course, with the public health officers. And that is clear, Natalie, from all the regulations. And it is not a carte blanche that says that the police can just enter private property just like that. That is not what the Honourable Prime Minister said, and that is not what I'm agreeing with. I'm agreeing with what the Honourable Prime Minister said in the context of a global pandemic where there have been over 1,200 persons having this contracting the novel coronavirus. Is no longer novel, and the public health regulations which permit the public health officers to enter premises to inspect. And in conjunction with the police officers, I am saying that in those limited circumstances, for that limited purpose, it is pellucidly clear that the police do have the powers in those circumstances to enter onto private property.
All right, tell us what part of the Constitution supports this senior counsel. Senior counsel, right?
Well, I am not senior counsel, let me say that. But let us start with the right which has, which, and rightly so, citizens are very much keen on protecting. It is the right for enjoyment and the right to property, sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution, and that much is clear. However, when you look at sections 110 and 133 of the public health ordinance, and you understand that the medical officer or any officer authorized by him has the power to enter and inspect, and then you have the police powers under the Police Act. When you put those together along with the Court of Appeal decision in Suraj, which has accepted and has said very clearly in no uncertain terms that the regulations are not ultra vires the Constitution. When you put all of that together, it means then that in the limited circumstances where you have a potential breach of the public safety on private property and the police do not have a warrant, but there's a medical officer or someone authorized, a medical practitioner or authorized by the local authority, in those circumstances, the police have the power to enter without a warrant.
So
let me give you the example.
Is it that the police will have to be accompanied by a public health professional, a public health officer?
In circumstances, it will be ideal in all circumstances, but let me give you an example which I am of the opinion may not warrant the accompaniment of a public health officer. If it is that a police officer is walking in the road and is seeing a private property, gated and everything, but one person, a man, killing a woman, he will stand up and say, well, let me go and get a warrant and come back to prevent that. Wouldn't he have the powers to immediately go and arrest that situation? If a police officer, without any public health officials, passing by in public property and seeing over 150 people congregating on private property, not wearing masks, in circumstances of this global pandemic, even without the accompaniment of a public health officer in those circumstances? Wouldn't that give the police the powers to do it immediately without a warrant? And it is limited. What the law says is not, it's not carte blanche. So therefore, the concern, and it's a legitimate concern about the infringement of rights under Section 4 and 5 of the Constitution, is legitimate. But in these circumstances, and what the Honorable Prime Minister was saying is, look here, if it is that there is not responsible behavior, then this is an option. And the option is authorized by the law, in my respectful view.
Right. But Mr. Scotland, I think for me, again, I'm saying that maybe the discrepancy or the dispute arose where we're talking about when that police officer enters that property, if we're establishing that he or she can, will he be able to enforce the public health regulations? So if you enter that property with 150 people not wearing masks, since the public health regulations are for public spaces, can the mask wearing be enforced in such a scenario?
You see, that is now with the public health officer accompanying him, there is no dispute relative to inspection, because the regulations, they do not confine it to public spaces. What we are saying in those circumstances, the police officer will be entitled to stop and arrest the situation that is going on that will potentially cause damage to those persons involved and further to the community by extension, and immediately stop it and enforce the regulations. It will be ideal at all material times that the police officer should be accompanied by a public health officer, someone authorized by the public health official. But if that is not possible at the time, madam, what are the police officers to do in those, and remember, I keep saying, in those limited circumstances? Now, there's been a lot of debate. I've looked at it on social media. I've seen the dissenting opinions, but no one has gone through the law as it stands that says, and it's specific. The Court of Appeal has, as recently as 2 weeks ago, has upheld the public health regulations as being constitutional. And
so you're talking about Maraj versus the AG?
Constitutional challenge.
Are you talking about the ruling with Maraj versus the AG and Dominic Suraj and Ors versus the AG?
Yes, yes.
And you're saying this established that the public health regulations stands and cannot be considered unconstitutional.
Listen. Do not take my word for it, madam. I would ask you to go to paragraph. Let me be of assistance to the public of Trinidad and Tobago. At page 106, well, we established that apart from the Privy Council, or but for the Privy Council, the Court of Appeal is the highest court of the land in Trinidad and Tobago. And at paragraph 106 of the judgment, here is what the Court of Appeal had to say, if you'll allow me. The regulation-making power at section 105 of the Public Health Ordinance has survived the scrutiny of Parliament on many occasions when this ordinance was considered and amended by Parliament. Accordingly, the Public Health Ordinance is not a statute which has reclined dormant for decades and which simply hides behind saving laws provisions. This statute, or this is a statute to which Parliament has been alive and which nonetheless has withstood the test of time in the context of an enabling statute which itself confers extensive powers for the preservation of public survival. It seems that the court should be slow to strike down subordinate legislation as long as it has not strayed from the shelter of the parent statute. Isn't that clear language?
And this is no straying from the
clear language.
So that's, and this is definitely not any straying from the public health ordinance.
No, once it is in keeping with the limited purpose. So rightly, I understand the concerns of the citizenry as to the infringement and the encroachment on rights, and particularly private property rights, which are enshrined under section 4 and 5 of the Constitution. So we start with that. These are enshrined rights, under Section 4 and 5 of the Constitution. But
Right.
what do we have now? We have a highly contagious virus. We have a definite word from the health personnel that it's spread without, and it can spread with persons being asymptomatic. And it is particularly dangerous to the most vulnerable. We always talk about the vulnerable in our society. Where are the voices now for the vulnerable in our society? I've heard all sorts of criticism about the fact that I have espoused a view that is different from the majority.
Right, I was just
Where
about
are
to
the
ask
voices
you about
now
that, Mr.
about the
Scotland.
vulnerable? And
What?
in these circumstances where there has been a spike, a definite uptake, an increase, an augmentation that is now putting a strain on the health services in Trinidad and Tobago that may very well affect our survival. And remember what the Court of Appeal said. It is for the preservation of public survival.
Right.
It is in
But
those
Mr. Scotland,
circumstances
as a
that
learned
the Honorable
lawyer,
Prime Minister made his comment.
as a learned lawyer and as a member of the Law Association, what is it that you were able to interpret that the Law Association didn't? Because it clearly put out a statement that it did not support what the Prime Minister was saying.
This, it may not be the first time that there'd be a divergent opinion relative to the Law Association's opinion. I have made sure, Natalie, and I hope before I came onto this program that they've provided you with I have done a written opinion on this because I considered it very important. And also, I consider that I may be biased unconsciously because I'm a member of Parliament and a member of the People's National Movement.
Yeah, but the law doesn't give room for bias, though. The law gives room for interpretation. So I don't even think that comes into play. What is it that you were able to interpret that the Law Association wasn't able to do?
No, but there can be a narrative that this opinion or my views are skewed because I'm a member of Parliament and a member of the People's National Movement.
Well,
and in those circumstances, I am towing the line. I have seen in the public domain on social media that I'm singing for my supper. I want to say to those detractors, I have a very simple supper: dry bread and butter. So my supper is not caviar. So there's not a lot of singing that I must do. It's dry. What shall we give him? Dry bread and butter. And I'm comfortable with that.
Right. So you don't have to sing for that.
No, not in this life or the other. And
but
I have put an opinion out in writing. And I asked the critics, criticize it. And more importantly, there was a judgment coming from the Privy Council in Surat. And in that judgment, Lord Hoffman, I think is at page 54, said, look, constitutional rights
is not absolute.
Absolute.
Right.
Are not absolute. And we are not saying, and listen, remember, we are not saying that it's a carte blanche for the police, any police officer, to enter into private property without justification. But in these circumstances, Natalie, I say that the Honorable Prime Minister was plainly right, and I offer my support in writing, having of course, given the rider or the caveat that I am a member of Parliament and I'm a member of the People's National Movement.
And
so you bear that in mind, so you take it as in the Latin phrase will say, cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, but that is why I have put forward my opinion, and I can support it by the legislation, by the law, by the ordinance, and by the Privy Council decision and the Court of Appeal decision, which I have just read out there to you.
Well, maybe you need to put that opinion out more, because it's not the first we're seeing this kind of disagreement about, you know, what the police, I think even the police didn't believe that it could do this, because we saw earlier in the pandemic where we had big parties all over the place, and the Commissioner of Police would tell us, well, the police cannot do this in these circumstances, or cannot enter this property under these kind of circumstances. So what really is it? Because I'm sure that we've seen some hesitancy. Am I right, Ruckus? On the police side, was it Bayside Towers? Correct. And we were told that we could do so much and no more. I don't want to misquote the Commissioner of Police, because we know that's going to be a whole different argument that I don't need. But we have seen where the police service has pulled back, to so much so that they had to have a meeting with the Prime Minister about what the police can do.
Well, that scenario led as a totally different discourse based on other factors other than the law. what I have found and what I would want to engage in is a sober discussion on the facts, on the law, and what the Honorable Prime Minister and what the government of Trinidad and Tobago is trying to do at this time. And at this time, I find sibling in the Court of Appeals dicta relative to the preservation of public survival. Natalie, I say it does not matter what your views are at this point. Consider public survival. Consider the most vulnerable in our society and what is happening locally. Also, cast your eyes on what is happening globally.
Right.
We say that in this case, however, the police is clothed with a limited power, along with the public health officials, with respect to the entrance on private property without a warrant. And in those circumstances, based on the legislation, based on the dicta and coming out of the Court of Appeal and out of the Privy Council, the rights under section 4 and 5, they are sacrosanct, but they are not absolute.
Right.
And therefore, in these limited circumstances, the police officer can enter private property without a warrant, particularly, and we say ideally, accompanied by a public health officer, authorized, of course, duly authorized by the chief medical officer.
All right, Mr. Scotland, thank you so much for sharing your legal opinion with us. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome, madam.
Keith Scotland there, the Member of Parliament for Port of Spain South and lawyer, member of the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago.